The great hall of Ashvorn Keep had never been so quiet. 500 people stood in rows beneath the iron chandeliers, their breath barely moving the candlelight. They wore their finest clothes, gold stitching, dark cloaks. They had come for a celebration. Every single one of them had come to watch Kael Ashvorn become king. He stood at the center of it all, tall and still, his silver-gray eyes calm as he looked out at the crowd. He was 28 years old. He had trained his whole life for this night. He knew the words to the ceremony. He knew which hand to raise and when. He had been ready for this for years, and not once in all that time had a single doubt crossed his mind. That was the thing about Kael Ashvorn. He trusted too completely. He believed in his family, in his pack, in the ancient laws of the 5 kingdoms. He believed that the world was honest, because the world had never given him a reason to think otherwise. Not yet. Councillor Voss Rhine stepped forward from the left side of the hall. He was a thin man with careful eyes and a voice made for public rooms. He unrolled a scroll with both hands and held it up like a man presenting a gift. He waited for silence, though the hall was already silent. Then he began to read. The charges were long: conspiracy, treason, 3 murders. As Voss read each one aloud, Kael felt the words land in his chest, like stones dropped into still water. He did not move. He did not speak. He stood and listened, and he understood, with a cold and terrible clarity, that the evidence had been prepared long before tonight. Someone had been building this case against him for months. Someone in that very hall, his father, King Dorian Ashvorn, sat on the silver throne at the far end of the hall. He was a broad man gone soft at the edges, with tired eyes and heavy hands that had once been capable of great things. He did not look at his son. He looked at the floor. He looked at his own rings. He looked anywhere, except at Kael's face. Kael turned, just once, to find his sister Lyra in the crowd. She stood near the 3rd column on the right, exactly where she always stood at formal gatherings. When their eyes met, she looked away. She looked away so quickly that Kael knew she had been told. She had been told, and she had believed it, and she was not going to say a word. That was the moment the last piece of him that trusted the world simply stepped back and closed a door. He was stripped of his rank, his title, and his wolf, in a ritual that the elder wolves performed in the center of the hall, while everyone watched. It felt like something being pulled out from inside him by its roots. He did not make a sound. The crowd watched him not make a sound, and some of them could not hold his gaze afterward. He was given a pair of boots and marched through the main gate at midnight, into the cold autumn dark, with nothing else. The gate closed behind him. He walked into the Ashvorn wildwood and did not look back. The first weeks in the wild were the hardest thing Kael had ever done, and he had done difficult things his entire life. Without his wolf, he was slower, weaker, and colder than he had ever been. He had no food and no shelter, and no one to ask for help. He failed constantly in those early days. He lost a trap 3 times before it worked. He misjudged a river and nearly drowned. He got sick from something he ate and lost 2 full days lying in the mud of a hollow tree. He did not allow himself to feel sorry about any of it. He simply noted each failure, figured out what went wrong, and tried again. That was all. There was no room in the wildwood for self-pity, and Kael did not bring any with him. 3 weeks in, he met Silas Cole. Silas was a rogue wolf who had been living alone in the wildwood for 7 years, after being driven out of a lesser pack, for reasons that were not his fault. He was broad-shouldered, deeply scarred along his left forearm, and completely unimpressed by the news that the man eating his spare bread was the exiled heir of the Ashvorn bloodline. "Well," Silas said, handing Kael a second piece anyway, "that explains the boots. They're too good for a man who clearly doesn't know how to trap a rabbit." Kael looked at him. "You're going to help me. I'm going to eat my dinner," Silas said. "If you happen to learn something useful by sitting nearby, that's your business." It was the beginning of the only friendship Kael had ever had that was based on nothing except honesty. No rank, no blood, no hierarchy. Silas taught him to survive the wild the way a practical man survives hard things, with patience, with attention to small details, and with zero tolerance for excuses. Kael, for his part, taught Silas something harder to name, something that looked like purpose, and that Silas had quietly given up on years ago. 93 days after the banishment, On a frozen night in the Iron Vale Mountains, Kael's wolf came back. It was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no roar, no ceremony. It was 3 in the morning, and Kael was alone on watch, and his wolf simply surfaced, quietly, the way the tide comes in. One moment he was a man sitting alone in the dark, and the next moment he was something much more. He shifted without thinking, stood in the snow on 4 legs for 1 full hour, and felt the cold and the forest and the deep silence of the mountains with every sense he had almost forgotten he possessed. When he shifted back, Silas was awake. He looked at Kael for a long moment. "Your coat is different," Silas said. "Darker, shadow through the silver. Is that a problem?" Silas shook his head slowly. "Moonlight and shadow. That's not a prince's wolf." He paused. "That's a king's." Word spread through the wildlands, the way everything spread through the wildlands. Slowly, quietly, and then all at once. Rogues had their own ways of passing information. Symbols carved into tree bark, messages left in hidden supply caches, campfire talk that traveled 50 miles in 3 days. What traveled was simple. The Ashvorn heir was alive, he was in the wild, and he was not hiding. Some came to test him. He passed. Some came to challenge him. He did not back down from a single one. Most came because they had heard that this man made decisions that kept people alive, and in the wildlands, that was the rarest and most valuable thing in the world. By the time Kael reached the Greymere lowlands, he had 11 people following him. He had not asked a single one of them to come. He had simply made decisions. Better shelter, smarter hunting grounds, a bloodless resolution to a conflict with a hostile rogue group, and 11 people had quietly decided that wherever this man was going, it was better than where they had been. That was when Elena Morn found him. She arrived in the rogue settlement on what looked like a supply mission for a border outpost, but Kael recognized a lie when it had been walking 3 weeks to find him. She was a healer from the Ashvorn court, quiet and precise, with quick dark eyes that took in a room the way a soldier takes in terrain. The moment she stepped into the firelight and their eyes met, something happened that neither of them had a name for yet. It was not soft, it was not comfortable. It was more like a door being kicked open from the inside. He was cold with her. He had no patience for complications, and a fated bond to a woman from the court that had exiled him was a complication that could break his focus at exactly the wrong moment. She was equally unwilling to be moved by it. She had come because she had spent 3 months quietly discovering that everything she had been told about Kael Ashvorn was a lie, and she owed it to the truth. And maybe to him to say so. She stayed, not because of the bond, because she was watching a man build something from nothing, and she wanted to be part of something real. It was Elena who said, one evening while Kael was drafting what would become the founding document of his empire, "You could go back. You have the wolf again. You have people." Kael did not look up from the page. "Go back and take what? The throne. What was taken from you?" He set down his pen. He looked at her for a long moment. "Going back would mean fighting for who I used to be. I am not interested in that man anymore. He trusted a world that was not trustworthy. He inherited power he never had to earn. Whatever I build now, I will have built it myself, with people who chose to be here, and it will be stronger than anything that throne ever stood for." Elena studied him. "That sounds like either the wisest thing I have ever heard, or a very long way of saying you're afraid to go back." Kael almost smiled. It was the first time in months that anything had come close to making him do that. "Watch what I build," he said. "Then decide." What he built was called Greyvale. It began with the Greyvale Accord, a document Kael spent 6 weeks writing after months of meeting with 11 rogue faction leaders, separately, patiently, listening to what they actually needed, rather than what they said they needed. The Accord gave each faction something the 5 kingdoms had never offered them: legal standing, territorial rights, and a seat at a shared council. No blood debt, no rank imposed from above. 3 laws, simply written, that every person in Greyvale agreed to live by. The factions signed, all 11. And then, because the accord was fair, and word spread the way word always spreads in the wildlands, others came. Wolves who had been living as rogues for decades because their original packs had treated them as less than they were. Humans who had been locked out of trade routes by pack politics they had no part in. Former servants. former soldiers who had grown tired of fighting for people who did not see them as people. Kael built them roads. Real roads, with stone and drainage and regular maintenance. He opened those roads to anyone who agreed to Greyvale's 3 laws, and he charged a single flat trade fee that was less than a tenth of what the 5 kingdoms collected. Merchants who had been taxed into poverty for years arrived at Greyvale's borders and wept at the simplicity of it. He built a medical system, led by Elena, that treated anyone who came through regardless of their background or their ability to pay. He built a military force structured around merit rather than inherited rank, where a former servant could command a unit if they were good enough and had proven themselves. He built a council chamber where 7 people sat in a circle, and there was no head of the table, because Kael understood that power built around a single point of elevation was power with a permanent weakness. The 5 kingdoms ignored it at first, then they noticed it with mild irritation. Then a major noble house from the Westmark Kingdom formally relocated its 1,200 wolves under Greyvale's charter, and the irritation became something sharper. Councillor Voss Rhine, who had by now consolidated most of the real power in Ashvorn, while the old king's health slowly failed, received regular reports about what was happening in the wildlands. He dismissed every one of them. Rogues organized like water, he told his advisors. Chaotically, briefly, and then they scattered. He did not ask who was leading the growing settlement. That was his second great mistake. His first had been assuming Kael would die in the woods. 2 years after the banishment, Greyvale had a capital city. It was called Varenhold, built in the mountain pass where the founding accord had been signed, and it was unlike anything in the 5 kingdoms. It had wide streets and public wells, and a market that ran 6 days a week, and a medical hall that was always open. It had schools. It had a council chamber made of local stone that cost less to build than one of Ashvorn's ceremonial staircases. It had 40,000 people, and it had an Alpha King, though he had not formally claimed that title yet. He was still waiting for the right moment. He was very good at waiting. The moment came when Voss Rhine sent a military force to destroy Greyvale's border settlements, framing it as a rogue suppression action. He did not tell the other 4 kingdoms. He did not tell King Dorian. He assumed it would be over quickly and quietly, like putting out a fire before it spread. Elena's intelligence network, built from the connections she had made in years of traveling between noble houses as a healer, sustained by people who believed in what Greyvale represented, gave them 4 days' warning. When the Ashvorn force arrived at the border, they did not find a rogue camp. They found a disciplined, organized defense force on terrain that had been prepared specifically for this engagement. The battle lasted 6 hours. The Ashvorn contingent withdrew. Greyvale did not lose a single person. The other 4 kingdoms received reports of the incident before Ashvorn's own king did. For the first time in his long political career, Voss Rhine sat in his chamber and felt something unfamiliar move through him. It took him a moment to recognize what it was. It was fear. The representatives of all 5 kingdoms came to Varenhold under a banner of neutral negotiation. They came expecting a rogue camp that had grown too large. What they found was a city. Wide roads, clean water, people moving through the streets with the quiet confidence of those who know they are safe. Order without fear. Prosperity built on simple fairness. Kael entered the meeting room last. He wore no crown, no ceremonial cloak, nothing that declared his status, except the way he moved, and the way every person in that room shifted slightly when he walked through the door. He sat down at the round table he had designed himself and looked at the representatives of the kingdoms that had thrown him away. He did not ask for an apology. He did not demand recognition of his original title. He had moved far past both of those things. He laid out terms. Greyvale's permanent sovereignty as the 6th nation of the continent. A renegotiated trade framework. The abolition of the rogue suppression laws across all 5 kingdoms. A formal charter that could not be revoked. The representatives argued. They negotiated. They pushed. Kael waited. He was extraordinarily patient, because he already knew how it would end. On the 3rd day, they signed. On the same day, Elena's network delivered a sealed package to each of the 5 kingdoms simultaneously. It contained 2 years' worth of evidence. The financial records connecting Voss Rhine to the staged murders, the forged confessions, the full paper trail of the conspiracy that had sent Kael into the wild and nearly destroyed him. Every piece of it was documented, verified, and impossible to argue with. Voss Rhine was taken into custody before the summit was over. He was tried under Greyvale law, which was transparent and fair, and conducted in front of witnesses. He was not put to death. Kael had specifically overruled that. He was kept in comfortable confinement in Varenhold for the rest of his life, in full awareness that the empire he had spent years trying to prevent existed and grew stronger every season. Kael considered this a far more fitting consequence than death. King Dorian was dying. Word reached Kael on the final evening of the summit, carried by a quiet messenger who said only that the old king had asked to see his son. Kael sat with that message for 4 hours. Then he went. Dorian was in a small room, smaller than Kael remembered, with the curtains drawn against the light. He looked like a man who had been slowly hollowed out by the weight of his own choices. He tried to speak, and Kael let him speak, and listened to everything his father had to say, without interrupting once. When Dorian finished, Kael sat quietly for a moment. Then he stood. He did not offer comfort, because there was none he could offer honestly. He did not condemn, because there was nothing left to condemn that life had not already handled. He turned to leave. Dorian reached out his hand. Kael paused. He looked at his father's outstretched hand. Then he walked out into the morning, where Greyvale and everything he had built was waiting for him. He was done being his father's son. He was the Alpha King of Greyvale. That was enough. That was, in truth, everything. 3 weeks after the summit, Lyra came to Varenhold alone. She arrived at the east gate on foot, no guards, no title, and asked to be let in using only her name. She was let in. She found Kael on the eastern watchtower just after dawn, the same place he went every morning to think before the day demanded his attention. He heard her footsteps on the stairs and did not turn around. She came and stood beside him, and they both looked out at Varenhold together for a long time without speaking. "I believed them," she finally said. "I believed them because I was afraid of what it would mean if I didn't." Kael was quiet for a moment. "I know. Is that enough, for me to just say that I know?" He finally turned and looked at her. She looked older, not in years, but in the particular way that people age when they have been carrying the knowledge of something they cannot undo. "No," he said honestly. "It is not enough, but it's a beginning." She stayed in Varenhold through the winter. They had more conversations, hard ones, with long silences in the middle. Nothing was fixed quickly, because things broken slowly do not heal overnight. But by the time the cold season ended, Kael had begun, in small and careful ways, to let his sister back into his world. Not because he owed it to her, because he had built something large enough that there was room in it for imperfect people trying to do better. On the day the 6th Sovereignty Charter was formally signed by all 5 kingdoms, Kael did not hold a coronation. There was no throne, no crown, no ceremony. Instead, he held a feast in the open square at the center of Varenhold, and he invited every person in the city. They came. The rogue wolves who had followed him out of the wildlands with nothing to lose, the merchants who had rebuilt their lives on Greyvale's fair trade routes, the former servants and soldiers and healers who had believed in something before it had a name. Elena sat beside him, her shoulder against his, and Silas sat on his other side eating an enormous amount of food with the quiet contentment of a man who had long ago stopped expecting anything good from the world and was now genuinely delighted to be wrong. Kael stood, and the square went quiet. He had written nothing down. He did not need to. He had known for 2 years what he would say when this moment came. "They took everything from me and sent me into the dark," he said, "and I want to thank them for that, because I would not have found any of this if they had not. But I did not build it for myself. I built it for every one of you who was thrown away and decided to make something anyway. This city, this charter, this council, all of it is yours. Every road, every law, every seat at every table. Yours. Do not waste it." The square was loud for a long time after that. Later, when the noise had settled into music, and the smell of food, and the comfortable sound of a city at rest, Elena leaned close and said quietly, "You could have taken the throne back. You could have had revenge. You could have made them pay in 100 ways that people would have understood." Kael watched his city in the firelight, 40,000 people who had chosen to be here, roads he had built with borrowed tools, laws he had written by lantern light in the Ironvale Mountains, while snow fell through the trees outside. "This is not what revenge looks like," he said. Elena raised an eyebrow. This is what winning looks like.